Thank you, Carol. Well, Carol, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and Reverend Richards, thank you very much for. Now, when I came in the door and saw that there was a large crowd on hand, my first thought was perhaps nightlife in Plattsburgh is not all it should be. But then my old friend Finn told me that he was getting extra credit for coming, so that explained part of it. And then I saw the enormous spread of cookies at the back of the room, and I understood the actual dynamics of the evening. So I'll speak for a little while, and then we'll adjourn to dessert, I think. It really is a pleasure to be here and in this beautiful room. I'm a Methodist too, but I live out in the woods, so in little tiny Methodist churches. And you know, I've been a Sunday school teacher at various points in much of my Methodist career, which means, you know, you're down in the basement with the felt board and the crayons. And I think actually probably a lot of Sunday school teachers suffer a little bit from sort of pulpit envy, you know. So I may be here a while, actually. Come to think of it, I may just hang out. And it really is good to be in Plattsburgh. I've divided my adult life between the central Adirondacks and central Vermont, so Plattsburgh is an important place in our cosmos, and it's always good to be here and see it doing well. You'll forgive me, perhaps, or maybe you won't, if I speak just bluntly tonight. I've been working for 30 years now on climate change, so long that when I wrote the first book about it, we still called it the greenhouse effect. And in that time, things have gone from the abstract and the theoretical to the extraordinarily dangerous. I don't know whether you guys will be able to see these pictures or not. We'll try and see how they do. I thought I'd start by showing you a couple of pictures from my summer trip last year. I was up in Greenland, which is a spectacular place. The biggest ice sheet by far in this half of the planet. Ice sheet several miles thick in places, extraordinarily beautiful. When it melts, and you get a sense of its scale there, when it melts, it will raise the sea level around the world about 20 feet. And it is melting very fast. To climb up onto the ice sheet in the glacier is to see that it's riddled with meltwater caves and these formations called moulins, where water is rushing down to the bottom of the ice sheet and beginning to lubricate its slide into the ocean. And I don't know whether you can really see that picture or not. It's the wheelhouse of the boat that was taking us to this glacier, where we were doing some filming and some work. And as you can see, if you can see, there's plenty of open water out the front window of the boat, but the chart clearly shows the icon for the craft that we were traveling in several miles into solid land. And I pointed this out with some degree of concern to the captain of the boat. And he said, "Oh, not to worry, the chart is 5 years old. 5 years ago, all this was solid ice as far as you could see. Now it's not anymore." We were there doing, the reason I went there was that I wanted to take the woman, one of those two women, the one in the grass skirt, is a poet from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, a low-lying. The Marshall Islands is a place that history has not done well by, at least in recent times. It's where we exploded one of the atomic bombs at Bikini Atoll, and now a large section of the Marshalls is off limits to human habitation as a result. And now, you know, the country is literally disappearing beneath the waves as they rise. People are having to evacuate their homes, graves are washing into the sea, so on. She's a wonderful poet who's written obviously a lot about climate change, and so I wanted her to write a piece and perform it standing on the ice that when it melted would drown her home. The video you can watch on YouTube or wherever one watches videos, there's millions of people who've seen it now, and it's quite spectacular. She recruited the other woman, a Greenlandic native, because of course her country is disappearing too in a sort of slightly different way. And together they produced this remarkable work. This is a video, and I'm just going to talk over it. We just happen to be it looks like it may be sideways, this video. That'll be particularly trippy. Maybe it'll work, we'll see. It takes a few minutes to get where it's going anyway, but we were just up doing some work, changing the batteries in a scientific monitor, and we took off on the helicopter, and we're flying over the head of the fjord, the huge glacier that points up into the... And you'll see in a minute what happens now every second of every day around the world, the melt of a big piece of ice. This is the reality now. There's nothing abstract or theoretical or in the future about climate change. It's become the dominant daily fact of the world that we inhabit, by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done. The extra coal, the coal and gas and oil that we burn, and hence the carbon that we put into the atmosphere, traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. It traps it in the air, which is heating, and in the oceans, which are heating. There was a study published today saying that the oceans are heating about 40% faster than people had thought, and calculating that the heat equivalent of one Hiroshima-sized bomb has been exploding every second of every minute of every hour of every day for the past 4 or 5 decades in the oceans as their temperature has gone up and up and up. Can you see that big piece of ice beginning to crash sideways into the... it's even more dramatic when it's right side up. The waves, that piece of ice was 120 feet high, and the waves were about 40 or 50 feet high coming up, and it hit me. It hit me hard. This is what happens now on our planet, and the results of it are being felt in every way and by every kind of person, beginning, of course, with the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause the problem, the more you suffer from it. And that probably is a particularly important thing to say while one's sitting in church. The commandment that Christians have to love one's neighbor is a dead letter in a world where we are starving, drowning, and otherwise making life impossible for our neighbors. And when I say us, I mean us at this point in this country. America's produced far more of the carbon in the atmosphere than any other country on Earth over the history of burning carbon. And we now have the distinction of being the only country on Earth that has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords, the only international attempt to do anything at all about this. And so that's what I want to talk about for a minute, okay? Where we are, I'm not going to belabor you with talking about the dangers of climate change. We could talk about them all night, but I trust that by now you've seen enough of what's going on to understand what's happening. California catches on fire now 8, 9, 10 months a year. People die by the scores in the course of an hour because they can't get out of their homes. The drought gets so deep that things burn in a second. That same thing doesn't just happen in places like California where there are TV cameras to capture it. It happens all over the world where people lose their fields to rising oceans. We're spreading deserts spread out across people's land. It happens where there are no people. I was in Australia doing some organizing last year, and we went snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, which is the biggest living structure on the planet, except that it's half as living as it was 3 years ago. The waves of warm water that just keep sloshing across it have killed about half the Great Barrier Reef. We expect, even if we somehow met the targets that we'd set in Paris, which at the moment we're obviously not planning to do, oceanographers expect we'll lose 99% of the world's coral reefs by mid-century. That is an astonishing corner of God's brain just lobotomized, wiped out, scraped away. So I'm not going to dwell on all of that. Let's talk instead for a minute about what we could be doing instead. Because that part of the story is actually somewhat hopeful. 10, 20, 30 years ago when we talked about climate change, we didn't have a kind of confident answer as to what we were going to do to replace coal and gas and oil. We knew we had to, but exactly how was still difficult. Then engineers did the thing that engineers do. They figured out the thing that humans are best at. They built things and then built them again and then built them again and then built them again. The price of a solar panel has dropped 90% over the last decade. It's now the cheapest way to generate power around the planet, followed very closely by wind turbines, which have, in the same token, gotten better and better and better. Now the cost of batteries to store those electrons is dropping on the same kind of curve. The engineers have done their job. If we wanted to fix this problem, we could. We could make enormous steps very, very quickly, and people are beginning to talk about it. It is exciting to see. The congresswoman from the other end of this state, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the group of young people that have assembled around her talking about a Green New Deal, about getting America off fossil fuel by 2030, about giving any American who wanted it a job in this enormous transition away from fossil energy. Those are exciting things, but they raise the question, the kind of logical question, why haven't we done this so far, and why are we still dragging our feet? If we face the biggest problem that the world has ever faced, and we have a reasonable prospect about what to do about it, why haven't we done it? And the answer to that question, and the really infuriating part of this story for me, and the one that took me a long time to figure out, well, I should say, I'm not an activist by training. I'm a writer. And I wrote the first book about all of this. I was sort of thinking, I was my mid-20s when I wrote it, so my understanding of the world was limited. And my sort of theory of change was, I'll write a book and then everyone will change. And really, for 10 or 15 years after I wrote it, I thought my job was to write more books and give more talks and have more symposiums and so on. Because if you're a writer or an academic, those are the things that you do. I thought that we were in an argument about climate change, and that once we'd won the argument, our leaders would get to work solving the problem. But after a while, 10, 12 years into this, it became clear to me that we had long since won the argument. There was no dispute left in the scientific community about what was going on. We understood it perfectly well. But we were losing, having won the argument, we were losing the fight. And that's because the fight wasn't about data and reason and so on. The fight, as fights always are, was about money and power. And on the other side of the fight was the richest industry in human history, an industry that is apparently entirely willing to preserve its business model for another decade or two, even at the cost of breaking the planet. And that sounds hyperbolic to say. We've learned over the last 5 years, because of fantastic reporting, places like the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia Journalism School, we've learned that the oil companies knew absolutely everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s. I mean, before I wrote the first book about this, they had teams of scientists at work on it. It made sense. Exxon was the biggest company in the world at the time. Their product was carbon. They would understand, figure out what carbon was doing, and they did. They were able to predict, their scientists, with great accuracy, how fast and how much it was going to warm, and the senior executives believed them. Exxon started building every drilling rig that it built high to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. They began charting out how they were going to drill in the Arctic once it melted, and so on and so forth. What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they engaged in a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade campaign of disinformation to make sure that no one figured out what was going on. And that campaign was as successful as it needed to be. To wit, the current president of the United States believes, apparently, that climate change was a hoax manufactured by the Chinese in an effort to somehow steal something from us. That's the kind of thing that if you heard someone muttering on a public bus, you would get up and change seats, you know. But that's, you know, that's the idea that now governs the world. And it's the reason that we're making no progress. The power of that industry over Democratic and Republican administrations has been enough to make sure that really nothing significant has happened. When that finally broke through my somewhat dim carapace 10, 15 years ago, I decided that we should go to work, that we should try and build some power of our own to try and stand up to the power of the Exxons and the Chevrons and the Shells and the Peabody Coals and everybody else who was winning this fight. Now, we obviously were not going to do it by outspending them. As I say, I'm only a Sunday school teacher, not a theologian, but it is my firm belief that the oil industry has more money than God, and hence it was unlikely that we were going to outspend them. History does indicate that from time to time, you can bring people together in numbers large enough and committed enough to stand up to that kind of entrenched power and make change happen. And so that's what we set out to try and do. When I say we in this case, we started 350.org, which was really the first activist group just devoted to climate change. We started it out with myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College across the lake, where I do a little teaching from time to time. We had no idea what we were doing, except that we knew that it was global warming, so we better try and organize the world. That's why we called ourselves 350.org. The number comes from the safe amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a number we're already well north of, and about 410 parts per million now, and going up 2 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic melts, you know. So the name made sense, but the reason we took it was we knew we were going to try and organize around the globe, and we figured that Arabic numerals would trip more lightly over those linguistic boundaries that get in the way of things than choosing some words. And so 350.org we became. There were 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The one that took the Antarctic had to take care of the internet also. Okay, so we set out to do our thing, and that was to find other people like ourselves around the world. And so we ended up in a lot of rooms like this one, because Not everywhere in the world is there someone called an environmentalist, or that many, but everywhere in the world there are people who are worried about hunger, about development, about peace, about all the things you can't have on a planet that's rapidly physically deteriorating. And they were the natural allies. And we asked everybody, and this is 9 years ago now, I guess, coming up on 10, we asked everybody to take one day in the fall of '09 and do something where they were to kind of bring this idea of the peril that we were facing home. We had no real idea if we could pull this off. We spent a year out just talking to people. We got the first sense that it might actually gonna work 2 days early. We told everybody to do this on a Saturday all over the world, but that Thursday we were sitting in our little office in the old north end of Burlington around our one table with our one, and the satellite phone rang. This was before you could easily call anybody on a cell phone anywhere, and it was our leader in Ethiopia, and like all of us a volunteer, like most of us a she, like a surprising number of us 17 years old, and she was in tears. She said the government took away our permit for our protest march on Saturday. So we're doing this today before they can stop us. But that was brave, you know. Ethiopia is not a really nice government. But that wasn't why she was crying. She kept saying, we wanted to do it the same day as everybody else. We wanted to be part of the whole world doing this. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. We're really sorry. And we have 10,000 young people right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. And I was like, Luo, do not worry about the date, you've done good. And they had. It set off. The next 48 hours, there were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And it came from everywhere. I mean, the second picture that came in was from US troops in Afghanistan who said they made a 350 out of sandbags and said, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, you know. But the pictures were coming in from everywhere. And as they came in, sometimes 10 and 20 and 30 a minute coming in over the internet, one of the things that first really just sort of blew me away and made me really happy. You know, I'd spent my life hearing that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you worried where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. And it took not very long of watching these pictures come in to realize that almost everybody we were working with around the world was poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what almost everybody in the world is, okay? And what do you know, they're exactly as interested in the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future bears down hard on you if you're in such places. And it was beautiful to see, and people with a great deal of wit, and this was the first time we had big involvement of religious communities in this kind of fight. That pictures of the head of Muslim South Africa, and then next to him the guy who kind of runs indigenous traditions there, and behind them Desmond Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop at the head of a big interfaith march. This was, 6 or 7 years before the Pope wrote his wonderful encyclical on climate change. It was one of the first times that religious communities got engaged. I'd actually been to the Holy Land to do some organizing. Obviously a hard place to get around. There's a lot of checkpoints and barriers and walls and things, but people were very eager to work on it because the Dead Sea has fallen 40 feet or so as temperature has risen. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the big 5 on our shore. And the Israelis said, we'll do the 0 at Tel Aviv. And it was a beautiful thing to see, and it got a lot of press. There were 200 big demonstrations across China. China's a hard place to do this kind of work. A couple of them did end up getting arrested and things, but the China's extremely important. China now produces more CO2 annually than any other country on Earth, which makes sense because they have way more people than any other country on Earth. But they also now are installing renewable energy at a pace we've never seen on the planet. It's truly astonishing to see what's happening there. Those are your brothers and sisters in the Maldive Islands, in the Indian Ocean. The Maldives have been there for 5,000 years. It's a long, intact culture. It's basically paradise. It's all white sand beaches and coconut palms, and it couldn't be more beautiful. The problem is, this archipelago, which stretches 1,200 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean, the highest point is about 2 meters above sea level. That's a bad place to be on a rapidly warming planet. The odds of them making it through the century are pretty slim, but they're fighting hard. That's the Student Government Association holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the kind of existential problem that we face. This was the biggest story on Google News for about 36 hours, and I think the reason is that newspaper after newspaper, TV station, covering it because the people didn't look the way they thought that environmentalists were supposed to look like. So there's Yemen, that's about the toughest place in the world. That zero is all formed by women in full black burqa. So to us, it doesn't look like the, Adirondack Council having its monthly meeting, but their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future, about their children, about the rest of creation. It was marvelous to see. There were, I will confess, 400 or 500 pictures that ended up in a file just marked 350 adorable. And they were extremely adorable, and they were also hard to look at. Those girls are going to be refugees in their lifetimes, and not from anything they did. Okay? So, we've gone on to do this kind of organizing all over the world. As Carol said, we think we've done about 20,000 demonstrations, and it's work we really love. It takes us to places that, some of them obvious, some of them places we'd never heard of, some of them places we'd heard of for other reasons. It's extraordinary to see the world kind of come together to try to do, we do these enormous art projects so big you have to, tens of thousands of people making these images. There's an altogether too familiar image now, people having to escape through the roof of their home as the water rises. Tens of thousands of people forming these images. That was my favorite. I don't know if you can really see it, but it's one of those dried out riverbeds now in the desert Southwest. And when the satellite came over at just the right moment, 3,000 or 4,000 people put blue blankets up overhead to kind of bring the river back to life for a minute. Extraordinarily beautiful. If we had 50 years to deal with this problem, this is just what we would keep doing. This kind of education, as it were, all over the world. Because human beings change best, and human economies and civilizations, when they change gradually. It's just easier. It's less traumatic. It's less costly. It's less expensive. The next generation gets better at this, and then the generation after. That's how it should work. The problem is we have negative 50 years to work on this. We had to start 50 years ago and we didn't, and now we're a mile behind, and so we have to move endlessly quicker than is comfortable. Sometimes this kills me to think about. I mean, when I wrote the first book about this 30 years ago, if we'd started moving then, we would have had to move, maybe we'd have to have proved our energy efficiency about 2% a year, 1.5% or 2% a year to end up where we needed to be. Since we didn't do anything 30 years ago, and since the world's gotten bigger and richer and burn more, now we're in a place where we have to move about 12 or 15% a year, and that's unbelievably hard. May not be possible. It's going to take an all-out effort, that Green New Deal here and around the world. In order to push, we figured out, or we decided, that in along with education, we needed to do some serious confrontation too. These are some pictures from the beginning of the fight against the Keystone pipeline 7 years ago. This pipeline down from the tar sands of Canada that became a huge, really the signal environmental battle of the last era. When we started, we thought we had no chance whatsoever, and no one else did either, because the oil industry had never lost any battle like this. National Journal, the kind of trade paper in DC, interviewed its 300 energy insiders, its energy experts, and asked them, would this company, TransCanada, get its permit? And 93% said they'd have it by the end of 2011. And then more people showed up to go to jail than have gone to jail in any civil disobedience action in the last many years in this country. 1,200 and some over the course of a couple of weeks. And that was enough to get people's attention on it. And then this started spreading all over the world. And everywhere for the next 2 or 3 years that Barack Obama went in this country, people were there with signs gently confronting him. We surrounded the White House with people 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder, around the 1.5 mile perimeter of the White House. And first, Barack Obama said, well, maybe we should not make this decision till after the next election. Okay, that's good. And then he said, maybe we should make it after the next midterm election. Okay, that's good. And finally, he said, okay, we're not going to build this pipeline. You're right, it doesn't make sense. You can't keep... Donald Trump, of course, very eager to build it. In fact, he apparently thinks it's already been built. He's at several occasions announced that he's successfully built the Keystone pipeline. So far, a great combination of indigenous groups in the Midwest and farmers and ranchers have kept it at bay. We may come to a head this spring or next spring, but in the meantime, not only have we kept 800,000 barrels a day of the dirtiest oil on earth underground for these 8 years, more to the point, it's sparked a understanding that you actually can stand up to these guys, and now everything gets fought all the time. No one builds a pipeline, no one builds a fracking well, no one builds a coal terminal, no one builds anything without a fight. And a lot of the time we win this fight, and even when we don't, we cost those guys an enormous amount of money and time and effort. The head of the American Petroleum Institute said last year in a speech at an industry conference, he said, we somehow have to stop the Keystoneization of everything that we do. And I confess my dark heart was happy to hear him say that. New York State, of course, was one of the centers of this. Governor Cuomo signed a bill banning fracking in this state because he had no choice. Activists across the state organized in remarkable numbers and with remarkable creativity to the point where he had no choice, an action that's now been followed by many other states, including last week Florida, and by countries around the world. So it's been beautiful to watch. Look, I don't know whether this is going to happen fast enough, because we have friends everywhere who are reminding us always that it isn't. Those are our colleagues in Siberia. We now get forest fires 4 or 5 degrees of latitude north of where we've ever seen them before, because things dry out so fast now. Those are people in Micronesia who are actually having to leave their homes. The ocean has washed over them. That top red balloon is where the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. If it's not drying out, it's flooding. These people live in the part of Pakistan that in 2010 had the biggest flood since Noah. So much rain fell up on the Khyber Pass that it just spread out in the Indus River till it covered a quarter of the country. 20 million people had to leave their homes. That's the equivalent of everyone between Boston and Baltimore having to leave their homes. We got some sense of what that felt like during Hurricane Irene, but this was on a whole different scale. And take a look at them. it's pretty clear that they had not done much to cause the problem that they found themselves in. So I don't know if we're going to win this fight or not, but I know we're going to make a fight of it. That demonstration, maybe the smallest of the 20,000 that we've coordinated, was in Haiti, in a town called Lake K. And at first it struck my eye because just the signs those kids were holding. Your actions affect me, which is completely true. In fact, the year after that, a hurricane of unprecedented strength pretty much wiped out Lake K. 80% of the buildings were destroyed in that hurricane, which was the largest storm ever to hit that part of the world. I have no idea if those kids are still alive or not, because a lot of people died there. Your actions affect me, but not really vice versa. There's not much that anybody in Haiti can do to change the way this story comes out, all right? They don't, well, they can't burn less fossil fuel. They're not burning hardly any now. They can't come to the White House and protest. We don't really let people into the country for purposes like that, or really much else anymore. They can't divest their holdings in, I mean, the endowment of the Methodist Church is 10 times the size of the endowment of everybody in Haiti doing everything they could possibly do all at the same time, you know. So it really is up to us, and increasingly people are taking up that challenge, and as I say, some of the time we're winning. And sometimes it's really beautiful to see. This was the biggest, before the Women's March 2 years ago, this was the biggest march about anything in this country, and maybe in history. 400,000 people streaming through the streets of New York, and it was a beautiful day, and I bet some people here were there, and it was an awfully lot of fun. And all same thing happening, you know, now all over the world. But I thought maybe the last pictures I'd show you were just some pictures from right that same time, but from the other corner of the world. These are our colleagues, and they're wonderful colleagues at 350 in the Pacific. In these nations that may not exist much longer, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Micronesia, the Solomons, the Marshalls, places like that, just too low to the water. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And they are fighting. Each one of those island nations built a traditional war canoe, and they took them to Newcastle in Australia, which is the biggest coal port on planet Earth. More coal goes through it every day than any place on Earth. And there they blockaded things with those canoes for a day. They kept the biggest ore ships on Earth in the harbor for a day in a really powerful symbolic protest. In fact, it really reached people. Newcastle, a month later, biggest coal port on Earth, its city council voted to divest its pension funds from fossil fuels. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it. But the reason, the sort of image I want to leave is just the image of what it looked like. I'm a writer, and so I'm conscious always that there are certain tropes, certain images that all humans kind of recognize and that move us in almost predictable ways. And one of the great images on Earth, one of the great ideas on Earth is the kind of battle between the few and very big and the small but many, okay? That's the Death Star and the Rebel Alliance, right there in front of you. And once you start looking for it, you can see it all over the place. That's from Seattle, Washington, that same summer. That structure in the background there is a 40-story drilling rig that Shell Oil decided they wanted to go drill in the Arctic with, open up the Arctic to drilling. Think about that just for a minute. Scientists had warned for a long time that if we heated the planet, the Arctic would melt. Then the Arctic melted. Shell Oil did not look at that and say, Maybe we should go into the solar panel business. This isn't working out so well. Shell Oil looked at that and said, now that it's melted, it'll be easier to drill for some more oil up there. That's a challenge to the idea that the big brain was a good evolutionary adaptation, okay? Happily, there were a lot of people who had perfectly good brains and very large hearts attached to them who decided to get in the way, and they got out there and canoe, small craft of all kinds. We called them kayaktivists, and they did so much brand damage to Shell that by the end of the summer, Shell threw in the towel. They said, we've spent $9 billion in this project, but we're not going to spend any more because we can't take it anymore, essentially. I don't know if we're going to win this fight or not. This is the first timed test that humans have ever had. We're not used to that kind of fight. We're used to fights where, Dr. King always said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, i.e., this may take a while, but we're going to win, okay? That's a very comforting thought. The arc of the physical universe seems to be short and bend toward heat. And if we do not win soon, we will not win at all. And so that's why it feels kind of desperate to me. That's why we need to figure out those things that we can do to accelerate, push this process. That's what we have to do in our time on Earth, just like people a generation and 2 generations ago had to figure out how to stand up to fascism in Europe, okay? And in order to conquer it, they had to go kill people and get killed. We don't have to do that. We have an easier task, but a huge one nonetheless. We have to figure out how to make this change happen fast, and to do it, we have to break the power of the fossil fuel industry. The only way we can do that is by pushing hard. Sometimes it's in court. The Attorney General of the Empire State, Barbara Underwood, went to court 3 months ago to sue Exxon for lying about climate change, a fraud case. That's a good thing to do. Sometimes it's with legislation. Hopefully someday will come when people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez are able to get these Green New Deal things passed. But if that's going to happen, it's going to take the rest of us pushing and pushing hard. I'll end by telling you my favorite story of the last year, which is about a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl named Greta Thunberg, who I've gotten to know and really like. She talks regularly about the fact that she's autistic, and she points out that autistic people tend to have a habit of focusing on one thing with great specificity, and her one thing is climate change. When it came time to go to school this fall in Stockholm, she decided she wasn't going to go. Her argument was, if adults could not be bothered to protect the planet for her future, there was not any particular need for her to go prepare for her future either. And so she just took a sign that said climate strike and sat down on the steps of the Swedish parliament and stayed there week after week until she became the just galvanizing force in Europe to get people back engaged in the fight, even in the midst of all their troubles with Brexit and immigration, whatever. Just focused again on this most important of issues. It was brilliant. And I think you're going to have to keep your eyes open for this. I think, and actually I'm sort of curious to see what people's reaction would be, but I think we're going to try and do this across the world sometime later this year. Tell everybody, not just kids, to take a day and walk out from wherever they are and go do, whether it's go engage in protest or go engage in putting insulation in their neighbor's house or building solar panel or a bike path or whatever it is, a day to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we understand that this is an existential problem and we understand that business as usual is not solving it, that we have to act somewhat out of the ordinary, that we have to break our habits some, if only for a day. And so I hope you'll I'll pass word up to Plattsburgh as we get more plans, if we do, and if we do, I hope people will decide that it's worth backing the young people who are taking the lead here. Looking at the demographics of this room, I will say that it really is one of the, and here I will end because I've dragged on, I will say that it's really an opportunity now for those of us who are older, we're on the edge of being the first generations on this planet to leave it in demonstrably worse shape than we found it, okay? And it's time for us to act. Young people are leading this fight all over the world, including the beautiful fight for the Green New Deal. It's no accident that the youngest congresswoman in history is the one who's making this fight, because these are the people who are going to have to live their whole lives amidst this inferno if we don't get it under control. But there are all kinds of things that older people can do. I remember writing the letter asking people to come to Washington and get arrested. And it's a hard letter to write. But one of the things I said in it was, I did not think that young people should have to be the cannon fodder for this particular activity, because if you're, 19, it's possible that getting arrested is not the best thing for your resume that there could ever be. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? And so it was with pleasure that I saw lots of people with hairlines like mine arriving. Now, we did not ask people as they were getting arrested, we did not say, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But cleverly, I thought, we said, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was so old that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so old that I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was beautiful. Young people who were there got to see elders behaving in the way that we actually need elders to behave in a working society. I don't mean you have to all go get arrested. Probably right now we've got no particular thing to get you arrested for, but I do mean that you have to step up. You have to go somewhere outside your comfort zone, because the planet is a zillion miles outside its comfort zone. Okay? This is the challenge of our time, and I don't know. I can't guarantee you're going to win, but I can guarantee you that if you join in this fight, you will have brothers and sisters in every corner of the planet who are doing it with you and with the same hopes and the same fears and the same kind of sense of solidarity and love for each other that animates movements at their best. So thank you all for coming out tonight and for being a part of this. Over to you.
Good question.
No need to. Let's do questions.
For a couple minutes. Bill does have time to take a few questions. We're going to ask one question per person. The Scouts have 2 microphones, and so we're asking you to speak into those microphones so that everyone has a chance to hear there. So if you could raise your hand, I can ask them to go. I see one way in the back there on my right.
Phil, could you make some remarks about the people amassing on our southern border?
Say again? About?
About people amassing on our
Sure.
southern border and about climate change in
Sure.
Honduras.
Sure. One of the things that I was sort of one of the points I was trying to make is that really these are, I mean, in part, climate change is a question all about science. I mean, you have to understand the science of it, not very deeply, just at the level I was describing tonight is plenty. If you understand that there's 350 parts per million is the safe line and we have more than that, that's plenty of science to understand. I mean, in the same way that if you understand your cholesterol is supposed to be 200 and it's 300, then you're in trouble. You don't need to understand everything about the lipid system. You just need to know that you have to change what you eat and how you exercise and so on. Same situation. So science is part of it, but you also have to have some sense of justice to understand any of this. And what's happening with human migration is a very good example. So take people in Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua, which is where, in El Salvador, which is where many refugees headed for the US are coming now. If you go look at a map, those countries are pretty unique around the planet in that they have an ocean on either side of them in close proximity. There's not many places you can find like that in the world. Those oceans, the oceans are heating much more rapidly even in the atmosphere. About 93% of the heat that we're trapping in this planet is going into the oceans. And the waters are heating quickly, and that's producing a variety of meteorological effects, particularly in places like that. They've had a deep and enduring drought across that part of the world. And that's one of the reasons that people are on the move. They leave their home because they can no longer grow anything where they live. The first move is always to the capital city, and to live in a cardboard box or a corrugated tin shed or something for a while. But those cities, because in part of the great influx of people, are violent and difficult places without employment. In desperation, people head elsewhere. Another place like that illustrates this problem really well is Syria. In the first decade of this new millennium, Syria, really that whole part of the world that we used to call the Fertile Crescent, had the deepest drought in the thousands of years for which scientists can sort of go back. And 1 million farm families left the farm in the course of 2 years in Syria and moved into the cities. And that was one of the things, maybe the main thing, that triggered what was already a tense, unjust, repressive country just kind of exploded. And the civil war that resulted has sent several million people fleeing up into Europe and screwed up the politics of Europe in profound ways, and some of that fear and hysteria washed across to the Atlantic and did its part to screw up our politics too. The reason one should know about this is because those numbers are tiny compared to what's coming. The best estimate is that we can expect 300 or 400 million people on the move because of climate change by the middle of this century. That's an order of magnitude more than we had on the move even during the bloody 20th century with World War after World War. If we're not able to rein this in, I mean, this is the reason that fear of human migration and the insecurity and violence that comes with it is the biggest reason that the Pentagon has been really fairly acute and realistic in its assessment of climate change and in its effort to do something about it. That and the fact that a huge percentage of the US military installations around the world are themselves at grave risk from climate change because often they're near the water. So what's happening on the border with the South is a good prefiguring of what we can expect. And building walls is not an answer that's going to work for very long. There's sort of levels of human desperation that go. I mean, I preached the. We'll just, since we're in church, we'll just talk for a minute. I preached the Christmas Eve service at our little church out in the woods, and I got to say, if you take the Christmas story and that baby who had to flee and things seriously, whatever else we're doing, whatever else you can say, putting people in cages is not one of the things that we're allowed to do if we're moral human beings. And in practical terms, the situation that we're setting up is explosive, and the best way to diffuse a lot of it is to slow down this process of climate change before it drives everyone out of the place where they are. And by the way, that migration is going to be as profoundly internal as it is external too. I mean, there are large parts of this country that can't deal with what's coming. This would be a poor time to buy property in coastal Florida. Florida was always the where everybody in places like Plattsburgh kind of dreamed of, this time of year. Not a good dream anymore. Would be, unless you're really ready for hospice care, I would suggest not heading to Florida anytime soon.
I see a question over here. Yeah. Use the
You got microphone right behind you.
Thank you very much for coming. God bless you. How about placing a price on the carbon? Can you speak about that, and then that fee being returned to the population? Surely the people that are going to be affected the greatest by the expense would benefit most from that price, and the Trumps would
Sure.
Here.
Sure. So one of the distinctive things about carbon is it's the only pollutant that one's just allowed to pour into the atmosphere for free. So, if you run a restaurant in Plattsburgh, if you run the Kentucky Fried Chicken or the Taco Bell or all the other things that are lined up there as you come into Plattsburgh, the cheapest way for you to deal with your garbage at the end of the night would just be to go toss it out in the street, okay? You wouldn't have to pay someone to put it away or, deal with it in any way. The only problem with that would be that within a few weeks, Plattsburgh would have a big rat problem and you'd all be getting leptospirosis and so on. And so we don't allow that. We make people clean up after themselves. In fact, that's one of the kind of basic marks of a civilization. The exception to this rule is the fossil fuel industry, which is allowed to pour carbon into the atmosphere for free to use it as an open sewer. And that's the reason that that fossil fuel is even remotely competitive anymore with renewable energy. If it had to pay the price for the damage it was doing, then it would be, much too expensive for people to use. So people have correctly said over the years, we should put a price on carbon. There's no intellectual reason not to, and we should definitely do it, and a good way to do it is to return the proceeds to people month by month. That said, this is one of these cases where I have to restrain myself from saying, oh, if only you'd listen to me when, because 30 years ago, it would have taken a small price on carbon to nudge us in the right direction and change our trajectory in a kind of, at this point, if you were going to rely on a carbon tax alone to do what needs doing, the tax would have to be so large that no conceivable political body would ever pass it, okay? So now we need a combination of a price on carbon, we need a massive government program to build out renewables as fast as we can, and we need government action to keep carbon in the ground, to make sure that we do not anymore go drill new oil wells, build new coal mines, whatever it is. All those things, Senator Sanders sponsored the good legislation to keep carbon in the ground. The Green New Deal envisions this massive and subsidized build out of renewable energy very quickly. And people like Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, who just announced for president, are backing carbon tax in a big way. Some combination of all these things is going to be what's required, but I don't want anyone to misunderstand the scale of the change that we need to make. In order to build the sufficient amount of renewable energy in the short time that we now have, it requires a mobilization of industrial capacity akin to that happened in the first 2 or 3 years of World War II. The first 2 or 3 years after the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the kind of breakout of the Third Reich. In this country, we did that then, and we did it with, extraordinary vigor. And now we need to do that here and around the world, not in competition with the rest of the planet, but in collaboration with them. And it's going to take everything we've got to make it happen. At this point, it's on the bleeding edge of the possible, but just. So good question. Thank you.
Yes.
What is your assessment of COP24 that just took place in the Senate?
The question was, what was my assessment of, they call them COPs, COP24, the Conference of the Parties. This is the 24th of these, marking pretty much the years since the early 90s that we've taken this seriously as a global problem. Each year in December, the world gets together to discuss the question, and each year, really very little happens. The exception to this, the first 20 of these built as in a crescendo, finally, to the agreement in Paris. That was a good start. A highly imperfect agreement. The reason that it was highly imperfect, the reason that it was a series of voluntary pledges and not a treaty enforceable on countries, was simply because the rest of the world had come to understand that there would never be 66 votes in the US Senate for a treaty that did anything. That the fossil fuel industry was powerful enough in the US political context, probably in the context of some other countries too, to keep it from ever happening. So Paris ended with this set of voluntary agreements. Even if people had followed those voluntary agreements, the temperature would still have risen about 3.5 degrees Celsius, 8 degrees Fahrenheit, far too much. Everybody knew that at Paris, that it was too much. The hope was that you would sort of touch off a virtuous cycle, that as countries began to do this work, they would see how cheap it was to put up solar power and wind power, and this would begin to accelerate past the point. And the hope was that at places like this last one in Poland this December, we'd kind of institutionalize some of that acceleration. In the meantime, between Paris and now, of course, what happened was the Trump administration, which has done everything it can to break that momentum. In fact, to add sort of insult to injury, despite the fact that we've withdrawn from the Paris climate talks, the US actually, this sort of defines chutzpah, sent a delegation to this international climate conference. And what did the delegation do? It held a big briefing urging people to put up more coal plants and things around the world. So at the moment, we're in a very bad place. We're not even meeting the Paris targets. It's why we need to build much more of a movement to put much more pressure on leaders so that we can't continue to have this kind of debacle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I just thought I'd mention an array of what I consider to be hope, and that is the Citizens Climate Lobby's legislation, or the legislation was introduced in both the House and Senate recently. It was introduced by bipartisan co-sponsorship. So that kind of bicameral, bipartisan realizes that it's just one component in the whole group of
Yeah.
things that need to be done. I'm curious if you have any advice as to how best to encourage the far left to support this component of such a plan.
So the Citizen Climate Lobby is a very good operation that's worked hard around these questions of price on carbon. And as I said before, that's a component of what we need to do. And the question is how to make it real now that it's been introduced, how to get enough support to get it to pass. Very, very hard to pass anything, obviously, because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. But the only way to get anything to change, the only way is to build movements large enough that politicians have no choice but to take note. In 2020, we come up on the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. Okay. Now we think of Earth Day as just this sort of thing that happens every spring, and you go to the park and there's a speech and people set up a booth and they talk about recycling, whatever. But the first Earth Day in 1970 was a big, noisy, rude affair all over the country. And it got 20 million Americans. That was in 1970, 10% of the population out on the street on a single day. That's the largest gathering of Americans ever about anything, okay, in a single day. And the effect on our political system was dramatic. Within the next 4 years, we passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, all the legislation that we're now dismantling, okay? And they were all passed and signed by Richard Nixon, a guy who literally had not the slightest interest in the environment at all, okay? This was a guy who famously was photographed walking on the beach in Santa Barbara in his, black Oxford shoes, okay? But he had no choice. People had come out in numbers enough to change the zeitgeist, to make it so that it was political suicide for anyone to stand up to. And that's what we need now. And it doesn't need to be focused on any particular law, or it doesn't need to be, and it's not going to be 20 million people out in the street saying we need this particular carbon tax. It needs to be 20 million, 30 million people taking age, say maybe walking out from their school or job for the day and saying, we need action now on climate change, and damn it, you have to deliver. And if that happens again, the same thing will happen again. The power of money in politics is very strong. Left to their own devices, the fossil fuel industry will win these fights. And so they can't be left to their own devices. We have to stand up in numbers large enough to matter. You can't just keep leaving it to the activists or the environmental groups or something to do this. It has to be one of those occasions when everybody from a wide variety, when it has to be one of those things when people don't expect in a town like Plattsburgh to be doing this, start doing it. If and when that happens, then we'll see some change. And if it doesn't happen, then the fossil fuel industry will get their wish, which is just to prolong this 3 or 4 more decades, and the result will be millennia of overheated planet.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. How about back here? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if any of you know, but we have a 350 Plattsburgh group here that 3 to 5 people show up to. The fact that all of you are here, so my question to you is, will you come to our meetings to get people to come? This year we didn't even have a climate march because nobody would come.
I will not come to your meetings, but I will tell you that if someone has a piece of paper and a clipboard, you should be standing in the back of the room right now getting every name and phone number that you can so you can let people know when this climate day is going to be.
When we came, we were like, oh my Lord, there really are people there. Why are they coming?
So it's because
350 Plattsburgh, that is what it says on Facebook.
350 Plattsburgh. 350 Plattsburgh. And someone, if I'm not kidding, I mean, the most important organizing tool is a piece of paper and a pen. If someone, we should have done this earlier on, and it's my fault for not thinking of it, but make sure that you, I mean, there's no reason at all. There you go. So stand at the back and don't let people, stand by the cookies and don't let people have them until they've signed up. This is the perfect place to end. There's no, I mean, I'm extraordinarily glad to have gotten to come and to get to see my old friends Kate and Russell and just hang out and, you know, see Plattsburgh, and it was a gorgeous sunset coming up the Northway, and I loved it. But there's really no point in me coming and sort of providing an evening's thoughtful entertainment for y'all. The point is precisely that you got to do something about this. This is the question of the moment in which we are alive, okay? This is in the way that, you know, if you'd been alive and kicking in the, you know, 1960s, you would have been properly judged on how you reacted to the civil rights movement or whatever it was. This is the opportunity that we have now ahead of us, and if we don't take it, then, as I said, the results are, it's not like someone else is going to get to rescue us 50 years or 100 years down the line. That's not a possibility with climate change. Once Greenland is melted, no one has a plan for refreezing it again, okay? So go to work. Do what needs to be done. I know that you're completely capable of it, and I'm extremely grateful that you had me here tonight. Thank you.